William Whiting Borden was born on November 1st, 1887, so that was 138 years ago yesterday. His father made a fortune here in Colorado in silver mining. They are no relation to the Borden milk family, in case some of those of you recognize that name. William became a Christian as a child, and because of his wealth, when he was 16, he was gifted a trip around the world, not with his parents, but with a chaperone. And on that trip, after he saw many nations and met many people of different backgrounds, he came home with a desire to be involved in missions work, particularly with Muslims. He enrolled in Yale in 1905, and in that first year, he started a student prayer group, which quickly split into two. And within 2 years, almost every student at Yale, from freshman to senior, was involved in one of many prayer groups that have spun out of the groups that he had started. Afterward, he went to Princeton Theological Seminary. And while he was there, several professors commented on the fact that they believed he was one of the most mature in his faith students that they had ever met. One professor said, "There were times when I was talking to him that I thought instead of speaking to a 20-year-old, I was speaking to someone who was my age." At the time he was at Princeton, he was serving in arenas that could eventually transition him easily into missions. So he attended an African Methodist church and taught Sunday school to children in that church. He began a new rescue mission using some of the money that his parents made available to him. One English visitor who came to the rescue mission was asked, "Of all the things you've seen in our country, what has been most encouraging to you?" He pointed to William, who was kneeling on the front row with a man who was homeless, with his arm around the man, praying, and he said, "Watching a millionaire pray with a bum." In 1913, William left for Cairo to learn Arabic and to try to understand the Islamic religion so that he could reach Muslims with the good news of Christ. And before he left, he told his father that he was renouncing his claim to any inheritance. William already had close to $1 million. He had about $800,000 that was under his own control. So he did have quite the fortune, but he was giving it away to causes for Christ as quickly as he could. So good morning, my name is Kevin Clark. If I haven't met you, I am the senior pastor here at Encompass Church. And today is week 3 in a 5-week teaching series and in a campaign that we are using to fund the expansion of our campus to meet our growing need for additional children's spaces. And both the series and the campaign are called Make Room for the Next Generation. Now in week 1, which was 2 weeks ago, I explained our growing need and I explained the plan that we have to meet it. And I invited all of you who would call Encompass Church your church home to begin to pray about what God might be calling you to do in relation to expanding our capacity to reach the hundreds of new families that are moving into our immediate area. In recent weeks, I told you we have averaged 5 new families every Sunday. And I told you a few weeks back, we actually had one Sunday, which was an anomaly, and we had 13 new families with 23 new children, all elementary school age or younger. Last Wednesday night, just 5 days ago, we had 32 new middle and high school students show up for the very first time. God is sending young people. Yeah, I think that's worth an applause. God is sending young people to Encompass Church to meet Jesus. And so as a church family, we have committed to raise $2.5 million over 3 years to build a new children's edition and to renovate some spaces to make room for that next generation. And that is just phase 1 of the 3 phases I talked about 2 weeks ago. If we give and pledge more than the $2.5 million, we will also begin work on the next phase or phases. So if you missed the campaign launch 2 weeks ago, I want to encourage you to watch the October 19th message, that launch presentation on our website or on YouTube, to discover the challenge that we think God is asking us to tackle in this new season. Make sure that you also grab a gift bag if you didn't get one. It has some resources in it to help you think through what your part might be in this campaign. And also take a look at our Make Room campaign page. It's at encompass.church/make-room. It has all kinds of information and resources on it. Today at 12:30, we also invite you, if you'd like to come to a question and answer forum at 12:30 in room 206. And any questions about the campaign, about funding, about the building project, those are all fair game. So bring your questions, ask them, and listen to questions that other people might have as well. And some of the elders, some of the staff, and I will be in the room to do our best answering any questions that you might have. If you can't come this afternoon, then tomorrow night at 7 p.m. we will do the same thing again. So we hope you will come and join us for one of those. And then this coming Saturday at 4 p.m. till 6 p.m., you are invited to a self-guided, family-friendly prayer walk in some spaces here in our building. And when you arrive, you'll pick up a passport at the first station. You'll go from station to station at your pace. At each stop, you'll find some suggestions for how or what to pray for in our campaign and our project. And at each station, when you're finished, you can also pick up a sticker for your passport. So it will be fun for the kids as well, too. It's very powerful to pray in a specific space, knowing that where you are standing is where God will be working in some pretty powerful ways. So bring your family. Make plans to meet some friends here and go through it together. If you'd like to do that, you can pray silently, you can pray out loud, you can pray alone, you can pray in a group. It's all up to you. It's self-guided. It's your thing. And then I encourage you to meet someone for dinner that you walk through the room with and talk about what you hope God will do and help your spouses and your kids and your friends really begin to imagine what God is going to do over the next several years. 2 weeks from today, that'll be Sunday, November the 16th, we will have a single service Sunday. We'll all be in this room at 9:30. There will be no adult classes, no student ministry classes. All the kids' classes will be running in the nursery and the toddlers, so you can have your kids in those classes. But on that morning, you will be invited to make a commitment toward the campaign, and I will explain how that's going to work next Sunday, November 9th. So if you aren't here next Sunday, I encourage you later in the week to watch online and see what is coming. Now, I know some of you have already contacted the church office or spoken to leaders here, and you're saying you are already ready to make your commitment. Thank you for that. You have noticed that the gift and pledge section of our Make Room campaign page is not active yet. It is grayed out, and that is intentional. I am asking you to wait to make your gifts and your pledges because there is more to hear that I think will help prepare your heart prior to making those commitments. And so next week, I want to share a challenge that I believe all of us should hear before we decide what God has called us to do in participation. So continue to use the devotional binder that you got in your gift bag. Continue to pray regularly. Look at the calendar in the front and see what events are available to you and participate in those as much as possible. If you are a guest, you are very welcome here today. Just know that the challenges that I share that are specifically related to our campaign are really family challenges for those people who have already decided this is their church home. So if what I just said was a little alarming, take a deep breath, relax, the rest will be safe. Usually, we observe communion on the first Sunday of the month, and today we are going to not do that. We are doing communion on the 23rd, which is the Sunday before Thanksgiving. We are doing it intentionally to tie the act of observing communion with our gratitude toward Jesus Christ for his sacrifice on the cross on our behalf. So today, if you have a Bible or a Bible app and you would like to follow along in that, make your way to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. And as I often do, I'll be reading from the ESV, the English Standard Version. Now, last week we learned how Jesus responded to the very common fear, common across humanity, all times, all places, all cultures, of not having enough. Today we're going to look briefly at a story about a group of people who had a far more reason to fear that not having enough syndrome than you and I will ever have reason to do so, but who face that fear with abundant joy that most of us only envy. As Christians, we're meant to desire what they had. They heard about a great need and they had a kingdom reaction. What was their kingdom reaction? It was a reaction of radical generosity. Can you and I be like them? Can we do what they did? Can we have what they had? Yes, we can. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 1 and 2. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Now that's a strangely cryptic sentence with a lot of little phrases that need to be unpacked to a certain extent. And so to make sense of this particular passage, we need a little bit of background info first. The Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the church in Corinth. The Corinth church had, in its recent past, been very tolerant of open sin. They had several factions vying for control and pridefully criticizing one another. They had people in the church who were suing one another in secular courts rather than using the advantages of being part of the church to solve their disputes. Their communion celebrations had turned into drunken feasts for the rich and ignored the needs of the poor sitting in the same room. One man at least was involved in well-known sexual immorality. The church was a mess and they were not doing anything about it. So Paul wrote 1 Corinthians to correct them. Now, by the time of this letter, 2 Corinthians, they had repented and made some significant changes. And so Paul's tone in this letter is far more diplomatic, far more gentle, far more as if he is speaking to those who are his equals, not those who perhaps have less maturity than him. He focuses on discipleship, on ongoing repentance, on growing in faith, and on developing joy. Now, in the mid-40s AD, so about a decade, a little more than a decade after Jesus' death and resurrection, the area called Judea, we would think of that today as mostly Israel, faced a series of very severe famines. In 45 AD, the Nile River in Egypt experienced what today we would call a 100-year flood. It completely wiped out the largest grain-producing flourishing economy in the Near East, and it took years for them to recover. And most of the Near East got a significant portion of their grain from Egypt. Then over the next 3 years, drought wiped out most of Judea's crops as well. And so across the Roman Empire, grain prices rose on average 800%. Thousands of people starved to death. And in cities like Jerusalem, where they were hardest hit, the residents struggled even more because the residents of cities did not grow their own food. So they had no subsistence living on which they could rely. The church in Jerusalem, which was not a large campus with a whole bunch of people like we are, but a lot of small groups that occasionally gathered together in larger settings, but usually met for worship and teaching in homes, they were able to survive because they were already in the habit of sharing all that they had with one another before the famines began. But their resources were also very quickly depleted. And so the leaders, knowing that Paul had connections with many churches around the Mediterranean that he had helped to plant and leaders that he had helped to train, they asked Paul to write letters to other churches to ask for financial help for the church in Jerusalem. So Paul, writing this letter to the church in Corinth, which today is a location in southern Greece, told them in his letter to them about the unexpected generosity of the churches in Macedonia, which is in northern Greece today. The generosity had exceeded all the expectations of anyone who knew anything about the Macedonian church. How and why were they able to do what they did? The Macedonian churches were extremely poor. They were beginning to face significant religious persecution. And under those circumstances, radical generosity seemed pretty unlikely. But Paul wrote this: "We want you to know, brothers in Corinth, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia." And then he describes their unusual generosity. Was Paul saying they received grace from God because they were generous? No, he was not. He was saying they were generous because they first received grace from God. What was the grace they first received from God? We tend to naturally think Paul must be talking about salvation from sin. He must be saying Macedonians were generous because they remembered they had received salvation from sin. But so did most of the other churches, and they weren't showing the extraordinary generosity of the Macedonians. Salvation is the single best example of God's grace toward us, but that's not the grace Paul was talking about. The grace the Macedonians received from God was while living in the situations in which they lived, they were being asked by God through Paul to be generous. What was the situation that they lived in? I already told you. Paul said they lived in extreme poverty and they were facing affliction or persecution. And in those circumstances, God asked them to be generous. And Paul says that was an act of grace. And we might think to ourselves, that just doesn't feel right. Isn't it unfair to ask people in those circumstances facing great need to turn around and be generous? God wouldn't do that, would he? But he does all the time. He constantly asks us to trust him with our needs. What is a greater example of trust than to be generous in the middle of a season in which we have our own needs? So Paul says it is an act of grace from God to challenge us to trust him more in our seasons of greatest need. how did the Macedonians respond to this demonstration, this act of grace from God? Paul says, in a severe test of affliction, in a season when they're being persecuted, their abundance of joy and extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. Paul says they were afflicted. They were being persecuted for their faith. Persecution was just beginning to rise as a serious condition in the Roman Empire at that time. It got worse over the next 100 years. But in that season, people are already losing their jobs, their homes, sometimes their families. They were being fined. Many were being imprisoned, and occasionally some were being killed. And top that off with the fact that they were extremely poor, barely able to meet their own needs. Yet Paul says they overflowed with a wealth of generosity toward a church in a bigger city that was better known in Jerusalem. What does that tell us about generosity? It tells us that radical generosity relinquishes the results. Radical generosity relinquishes the results. In those circumstances, God challenged the Macedonians to be generous. They did not respond by saying, I will, God, if you fix my situation first. Instead, the challenge gave them an abundance of joy. What Paul is picturing here is a bunch of people looking at each other in those little churches and saying, wow, God just asked us to be generous. He asked us. He somehow believes we have the potential with his power to trust him in our circumstances to the extent that we would come to the place where we could give out of our small amount to someone else. Wow, God thought that highly of us as his followers. We should do this thing. Unfortunately, when we, who are American Christians, are challenged to be generous in similar situations, though none of us have ever faced the kind of poverty and persecution the Macedonians were already facing, we often react with anger or with anxiety rather than with joy. Why? Maybe an example will help us grapple with the idea here. Imagine you're having dinner at your favorite restaurant, and it's an expensive place your family only goes to maybe once or twice a year. You choose some very delicious high-end courses, and at the end of the meal, you pay the bill and you consider the tip. If the service was really great, beyond excellent, perhaps you would consider tipping 25%. If it was good, kind of what you expected, perhaps you would tip 20%. If it was not good, or if the food was mediocre, which is rarely the server's fault, but we typically take it out on the server, you might decide to tip only 15%. Or if you're very stingy and vindictive, you might decide to tip even less than that. What does the tip tell the servers? It tells them how close they got to giving you the dining experience that you expected to receive. When God asks us to be generous, many of us tip God. We base our tip on how close he, the server, has gotten to giving us the life experience that we expected to receive. We ask ourselves, has he made me financially independent? Has he healed all my pains and my illnesses? Has he given me the soulmate and the family and the job and the home that I've always desired? Has he removed all the annoyances in daily life that I hate and replaced them with the comforts that I love? If not, we tip God an amount that says, my life experience is mediocre at best, and it's your fault. And we call that generosity. We tie our generosity to results that we desire. We think if God is not providing the life experiences that I want, I'm not going to trust him with my finances. I will trust me. I will make sure I get what I want, the results I desire, before I do anything that God wants or he desires. That's not generosity. That is rationalism. True generosity relinquishes the results that we want in favor of the results that God wants. What might that look like for us in a season like this in the middle of a capital campaign? For some of us in this campaign, that might mean delaying the purchase of our next vehicle so that we can give regularly for the next 3 years. For others, it might mean giving up one lunch out and one coffee through a drive-through per week so that we can contribute. The Macedonians were very poor, but they knew radical generosity requires that we relinquish the results to God. And they believed he could do better for them if they trusted him than they could if they trusted themselves. How did they demonstrate that trust in God? Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Paul says, "For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means, of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints." Now, this part of Paul's account in our culture sounds almost impossible to believe. The Macedonians gave according to their means. That part's not impossible to believe. We know they were very poor, and so Paul says they gave what might be expected of them based on their income, which initially was very little. But then he said they gave beyond their means of their own accord. I didn't ask them, I didn't badger them, I didn't harass them. They just chose to do it. And we think, okay, well, that seems a little bit unlikely, but I'll go with it because Paul wrote it. But then we rationalize that and we say to ourselves, well, they did do more than most, percentage-wise maybe, but they were poor, so it couldn't have been really that much more. So it's not really a big deal. But I want to tell you something about how their conditions factor into our assessment of what they did. If we live in extreme poverty and affliction or persecution, like verse 2 tells us the Macedonians did, to give beyond our means that it would be likely that you and I would be giving what we need to survive. People in the first century did not get SNAP benefits. There were no government social networks designed to protect the unemployed in the Roman Empire. They could not take those benefits and go to a big box store and fill up some shopping carts with several weeks' worth of groceries. They had to go to the marketplace every day and buy only what they and their families could use that day. And when they went, they had to barter or they had to pay with cash that day. So if on Sunday you gave beyond your means, it very likely meant that on Monday, at least the adults in your house probably wouldn't eat that day. By giving the way the Macedonians did, though, they were saying, in spite of my situation, I believe God will provide. What does that tell us about generosity? It tells us that radical generosity requires faith. Radical generosity requires faith. That kind of generosity is only possible for a Christian if we really do believe God will provide. In verse 4, Paul says the Macedonian Christians were begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints in Jerusalem. That seems wildly preposterous to us. They were begging to give? When is the last time any one of us in this room begged God for an opportunity to be generous? Now, to give some credit, I know one couple in this church that has repeatedly asked me to find a young couple to which they can be extraordinarily generous. But that is very unusual in our culture. Why is that? Because we don't really believe He can provide if we give stuff away. We say we do, but we don't. Radical generosity requires faith. It is not faith to give what we don't need or won't miss. What might it look like for us in this campaign to give with faith that God will provide whatever we need if we give beyond our means? Perhaps you and your family have decided you need an extra room on your house, and you've set aside the money. And if God made clear today He wanted you to give that money, would you have the faith to provide it as a gift? Would you believe that God would either provide another means to pay for that room, or that He would meet the need you had identified without requiring that room at all? What if you're paying an extra $120 a month for an elite subscription on a sports network that allows you to watch 4 games at once on 4 different screens, and God made it clear in the next 2 weeks that He wanted you to give that subscription money to this church to make room for the next generation? Do you have the faith that He could sustain your fulfillment with only 1 game at a time? I know that's heresy, but just consider how you would respond if it's something that you value. We might answer, I can't be expected to give up something I need or I value. Really? As Christians, do we aim only to do the minimum that is expected? Is that what we hope our coworkers will do? Is that what we hope our friends will do? Is that what we hope our kids will do or our spouses will do? Is that what we hope God will do? Paul did not expect his friends in the churches of Macedonia to do what they did, but when they did, he was blown away. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 5. He said, and this generosity, not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Paul said the generosity of the Macedonians was not as we expected. We did not see this coming. They floored us with their gifts, but not just because of the amount of money they gave. They floored us because they first wholeheartedly gave themselves to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. What does that mean? Something happened in the hearts of the Macedonians. That was part of the act of grace that God did for them. And whatever happened in their hearts made it possible for them to be generous beyond all expectation and beyond just giving financially. It changed them. It erased a natural tendency we have to look out just for ourselves or primarily for ourselves alone. They knew that radical generosity will redeem selfishness. Radical generosity redeems selfishness. The Macedonian churches were unbelievably generous, especially when you consider the circumstances under which they were living and under which they gave. But the bigger surprise for Paul was that they gave themselves too. They didn't say to him, here's some money, go use it the way God says. They said, here's some money, go use it the way God says, and tell us how we can serve him here and support you there by becoming a part of what he is doing. In July, I went with our student ministry mission team down to Guadalajara, Mexico for a week. And as we worked with several little church plants with very tiny congregations and almost no money, one thing was consistently clear as I watched the Mexican pastors and their congregations, and that is that every single person who was a Christian, who was part of those congregations, was serving. Every single one of them was serving. They had given themselves to the Lord and to their Christian brothers and sisters. For many of us, giving sacrificially is one of the hardest things we've ever been asked to do. But we live in the West, in a culture that believes with great certainty that money buys privilege, and unlike cultures in the third world, we almost always have some discretionary money to give. And so we tend to believe, maybe subconsciously, maybe not, that giving financially can replace the need to serve personally in the church. We tell ourselves, my dollars pay for others to do what I don't really want to do in the church. Nothing could be further from the truth. To give, even sacrificially, without serving at all, or to serve, even sacrificially, without giving at all, is each a form of selfishness that makes it more difficult for God to develop us wholly and completely in all ways into men and women like Jesus, which ought to be the goal of every single Christ follower. The Macedonians gave sacrificially, but they also gave themselves to serve God in whatever way that he asked or that Paul asked. What might it look like for us during this campaign to give not just financially, but to give ourselves to the Lord and his people? First, if you don't know Jesus, that won't make any sense to you at all. And so you must begin by putting your faith in him. You give yourself to him first by confessing your sin and your personal need for salvation, and by believing that Jesus died on the cross to pay for your sin and depending on what he did to make you right with God. But next, we must commit ourselves to his purposes for our lives, our jobs, our families, our finances, and our futures. His purposes first, not our purposes first. How do we do that? How do we know what those purposes are? We know that, and we do that by studying his word together or individually, by connecting in meaningful ways with other believers who sharpen us as we sharpen them, by growing intentionally in spiritual, emotional, and relational maturity, not just by hoping that will happen over time by osmosis and by tangibly giving and serving our church, our community, and our world together. During this campaign, we will demonstrate radical generosity has redeemed our selfishness, not just by giving, but by stepping up and serving as a church in both our setting here and in the local community as God continues to bring new people to our church. The biggest need we have right now, I told you 2 weeks ago, was a need for space for children's ministry. Close behind it, the second biggest need is for people to work in children's ministry. Many of you could do that, but you've decided you won't. You'll miss out on some of the blessings of this season if God has called you to a place to serve and you say no. If there's one thing, though, that we ought to be selfish about in this season, it's that we ought to selfishly desire more of Jesus. How do we find that? It's not just by sitting in a quiet room, reading our Bible, and never doing anything else for anybody else or with anybody else. That does have great value, but the complete experience of what Jesus has called us to know as a follower of him comes also through giving and serving. We draw closer to him, we learn his heart for people, and we begin to experience the abundance of joy that the Macedonians were experiencing, independent of our circumstances. Are you a person who's willing to give yourself to the Lord and to his people? In 1913, William Borden, who was close to what we would call a millionaire in his day, left his family's fortune behind and at age 25 moved to Cairo, Egypt, where he planned to study Arabic and to learn about the religion of Islam so that he could reach Muslims with the good news of Jesus Christ. He had already established that he was willing to give himself to the Lord. He had led other people to faith. He had started Bible studies. He had taught Sunday school classes. He had started prayer groups. He had served in a variety of arenas. He had also demonstrated he was willing to give of his resources, his finances. He had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars starting services and ministries and giving to people who were in need. And then, suddenly, just a few weeks after he arrived in Cairo, he contracted meningitis and he died. And we think to ourselves, what is God thinking? Here's a man who desires to follow him, and he takes him home. Why? I don't think we're going to get an answer to that question, not on this side of heaven, and honestly, I don't think we'll care when we arrive on the other side of heaven. But I want you to know some of the evidence of William Borden's commitment to giving all that he had and all that he was that was found in his possession after he died. He had a beloved Bible. In the Bible, dated was a 2-line sentence that he had written down after renouncing his inheritance. It said simply, "No reserve." Do we live as if we're not holding anything back? Do we live with no reserve? Once his father heard that he was renouncing the inheritance, his father told him, "I had plans for you. You were going to be the heir to run my business, but I cannot trust you with that now." After hearing that from his father, he wrote in his Bible another 2-line sentence, "No retreat? Do we live as if there is no retreat from the things to which God has called us? And only a few weeks before he contracted meningitis and died, as he studied in Cairo, thinking about what he had been called to be and do, which was to minister with Muslims in China once he had learned their religion and how they spoke and what they wrote, he had written in his Bible, no regrets. Do we live with no regrets? Do we live with a radical generosity that tells God, I trust you with everything I am and everything I have? I pray that this campaign will help us to experience that in ways we've never experienced it before.